Hi, and welcome to another edition of Seattle City Club's Civically Speaking. And today we are talking to Nick Brown, attorney and candidate for Attorney General for the state of Washington. Nick, how are you?
I'm doing well. It's good to be here.
Now, I feel like I've been running into you a lot at different events, running around Seattle. It's always one of those things where it's like you don't recognize someone until they've made news, and all of a sudden you see them everywhere. So I feel like I'm seeing you everywhere. And I'm glad that we're having this time to talk because I've been reading about you for a while and just had some questions around how you even became a lawyer in the first place. And then also as someone who's a huge NCIS fan, the whole JAG thing totally caught my attention. So let's
Okay.
kind of start from the beginning. You grew up where? You're local to Washington State.
Yeah, I grew up here. I was born in California, but moved up here when I was 2. So I'm a lifelong Washingtonian. My father, actually, both my parents were in the military. So my father was stationed up here at Fort Lewis. Moved up here a couple years after I was born, and spent almost all my life here in Washington. Lived in Germany for a couple years when he was stationed abroad. But I went through Pierce County public schools from second grade all the way through high school. So this is
Wow.
definitely home.
And then college, you went over to Morehouse, one of my favorite places to visit when I used to live in Atlanta. And then
Oh, I
off
didn't know
to,
that.
yeah, and then off, actually, so fun fact, I was actually down there when they filmed the School Days movie.
Okay.
I
Okay.
was too young to appreciate what was happening at the time. I just know I kept seeing Spike Lee running around. So I thought that was kind of cool.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and then
Yeah. So
you,
I left here to go to Morehouse College. Went on an Army ROTC scholarship. Morehouse is the school that Spike Lee also went to, which led to School Days.
mhm,
That really was a life-changing experience for me to grow up here in the Northwest, to go to an HBCU and get exposed to what that meant. And living in Atlanta at the time was really important for me. And then went off to law school at Harvard, and then started my legal career as a JAG.
so why law? What made you decide to go into that profession, especially having
Uh,
military family?
yeah, no, I mean, in some ways I kind of fell into it. I don't come from a family of lawyers or anything like that. I didn't grow up aspiring to be a lawyer necessarily. I was a political science major at Morehouse. I'd always thought I'd do something in policy work or in government, but wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. But law school was a pretty common path for people that wanted to get involved into government, because you could do lots of different things with a law degree. So I had it kind of in my mind, but also because I went to college on an ROTC scholarship, I owed the Army time after I graduated. And I started thinking about, how do I want to serve my country? What is the right role for me in the Army? And decided that being an Army lawyer, an Army JAG, which for the record is better than NCIS because that's Navy, I'm Army.
I
Uh,
know.
but I decided to serve as a JAG. And pretty early on, once I got into the courtroom, I really fell in love with being a lawyer and doing criminal work. Doing criminal work was not even on my radar when I went to law school, but I realized pretty quickly that I really enjoyed the work and the importance that comes with being in the criminal court, both as a Army defense lawyer, defending soldiers accused of crimes, and then switching sides to be a prosecutor and representing the country and the government was also rewarding. So it was kind of an accident. It wasn't a master plan, but it's really been how I've found my public service is through the law.
And I was just, and that you actually started to answer my follow up question, which was the type of law that you ended up practicing. What led to choosing criminal defense or criminal?
Yeah, well, in some ways it was kind of accidental as well. So my first job in the Army was doing family law, a little bit of consumer protection, defending soldiers and their families. And then I got assigned to run the Army Income Tax Center. So essentially being in charge of the Free Tax Service Preparation Center on the base. At this time, I was stationed in El Paso, Texas, at Fort Bliss. And in the JAG Corps, it's kind of viewed as a grunt job, as a job nobody wants, because you're dealing with taxes and all that stuff. But the upside for me was that afterwards they were like, okay, well, you did this service. What do you want to do next? And I kind of just looked around at the people in the office, and I really just gravitated towards the leadership of the criminal defense division. It wasn't because I had my heart set on doing that work, but I really liked the major that was in charge of that group. And I said, well, I kind of want to work for him. And then I started working for him, and then doing criminal cases. I was like, I kind of came alive. Like, this is where I was meant to be. This is the work that felt the most rewarding. It was hard. It was challenging. It felt really relevant to some of the issues that the larger community was facing. And it was great to be able to stand up and talk to juries and judges and represent people, and never really looked back after that.
So how did you end up back in Seattle after you served your time?
Well, I came back here for my last year in the Army at Fort Lewis. It was still Fort Lewis at the time, not JBLM. So my last year of my 4 years active duty after I got back from Iraq was at Fort Lewis, and became a prosecutor. And that was important for me. I wanted to come back home. You know, this was always my home and my state of residence, and wanted to come back and be here. And my family was still here. So I came back and finished up at Fort Lewis, and then eventually moved up to Seattle to join the Department of Justice.
And in the midst of all this, somehow you squeeze in Survivor.
Yep. When I was in law school, there was this brand new thing called reality television that was really brand new. I think prior to Survivor, the only thing that had been on was MTV's The Real World.
Yeah.
And my first summer of law school, the very first season of Survivor came on, and nobody really knew what it was. And it became this kind of water cooler summer hit. And so that summer I was interning at a law firm, and I just decided to apply for the show. I hadn't even watched the show. I just really liked the idea of it, of being stranded somewhere, surviving, trying to play this game. And then, I think 50,000 people applied for my season, and somehow I made it through. So I took a semester off of law school. I had to tell my parents I was dropping out of Harvard to go on this thing called reality TV. And my Army colonel father was not particularly thrilled with the decision, but it was kind of a fun adventure. And I got to play this game, and then came back to reality and finished law school and went on with my career. But I look back fondly on being on the show for sure.
I was going to say, does any of that experience going through Survivor prepare you for running for office?
In a very small but important way, it does. And what I think most learned from that experience, I mean, there are a lot of things, but when you come back from the show, and because reality TV was new, it was very popular. I think my seasons of Survivor was the second most watched TV show that year. I think American Idol and then Survivor right after it. But for about a year, you are kind of a low level celebrity. And it was really the first time that I recognized what it might be like to be a publicly known person. I would walk around and people would spot me, and they want to take pictures and get autographs and all these strange things. And for, I loved being on the show, but for a while it was definitely gave me some perspective on what it's like to be not a private person anymore, and all the highs and lows that come with that. And I've certainly thought about that as being foundational to being around government and an elected office. I worked for the governor for a long time. And certainly when I was U.S. attorney, it's a position where people see you on the news or read about you in the paper or what have you. And I think Survivor was the first indication of what it might be like to be a little less private, to lead a public life. But the rest of the show doesn't really translate to politics.
I was thinking more about particular sabotages along the way and looking out for just traps. I don't know.
No, I don't think our politics is quite like that.
So you already went into my next question too, which was, how did you get on the president's radar? How did you end up getting appointed for this role as the U.S. attorney for Western Washington?
Yeah, well, I mean, every state is a little bit different, but in every state, the state senators generally oversee the process. So here in Washington, Senator Murray and Senator Cantwell, they run the appointment recommendation process to the president, regardless of who's the president. Here, there's an application, and then you meet with their teams, and then they eventually make recommendations to the White House and to the Department of Justice about who they are supporting for that role. And that's really the most important part of the process. But when I worked for the governor, I'd gotten to know Senator Murray and Senator Cantwell and their staffs. And I started thinking about, the potential of going back to the office that I had once worked at and leading that office. And being in the U.S. attorney was a dream job in many ways. But I got to work with Senator Murray's people specifically on a bunch of things and got to know them. And as the opportunity, I first started thinking about it in advance of the 2016 election. And, obviously I wasn't, well, maybe not obviously, but I wasn't going to be a Trump appointee, but had Secretary of State Clinton won. I'd kind of put my name out there as being interested, but of course she didn't win. And so after 4 years of private practice and leading up to the Biden administration, I started going through the process of applying as well. So, I have a lot of thanks and gratitude for Senator Murray in particular and Senator Cantwell for their support and getting me nominated by President Biden.
And of course, my next obvious question, what made you step away?
It was not an easy decision. I loved being U.S. attorney. I liked leading a large public law firm and working with my team. And for folks that don't quite know what the U.S. attorney does, we are the chief Department of Justice representatives for the district. Every state has at least one U.S. attorney. Washington has two for Western and Eastern. And so I got to be the chief federal law enforcement officer for the department, to lead a team, to do all the criminal work on behalf of the Department of Justice, to do the civil work. And I loved it. It was a great combination of legal and management skill training and challenges for me. And I didn't quite think I would step away when I did. But when A.G. Ferguson decided to run for governor and I knew there was going to be a vacant seat, I really started to think closely about what I wanted to do. And for me, some of the most rewarding work I had ever done was working down in Olympia for the governor, because it was very focused on the things that I was seeing in my community and the things that I cared about, and just realized how much of an impact that we could have on improving people's lives. And for someone that spent most of their life around public sector work, the idea of being the Attorney General for the people of the state of Washington and seeing what we could do in that office was really appealing for me. And excuse me, we've seen really the important impact that AGs can have across the state, representing people, representing the government, and the national impact we can have as well. So I couldn't imagine being on the sidelines in 2024. At the end of the day, I knew I would hate watching the election and not being a part of it, because I just felt like it was what I was drawn to do mostly in my career, is getting back to the state work. So launched the campaign in July of last year, and I've been really thrilled with how it's been going.
What's been interesting for a lot of people, especially me, is as we go into this election year, seeing the two biggest offices virtually in the state don't have an incumbent. So it's going to be fresh new leadership coming in one way or the other for, governor's race and obviously race.
For sure. Yeah. And I think it's good for the state. It's really not only in those two races, but the lands commissioner,
Yes.
A lot of the statewide elected positions. It's good for democracy. It's healthy. And I think we've got good candidates in a lot of these offices running. And it's time for new voices there. So I'm excited about it.
So one of the kind of the hot topics right now, especially centered around the AG's office, is the high capacity gun
magazine.
Yeah. I don't know why I'm losing my words today. I haven't had coffee. So there you go. But let's talk about that. So, that the law was passed in 2022 to ban any ammunition magazines that held more than 10 rounds. Then, of course, earlier this week, it was overturned, but only temporarily. So that being said, and I know a lot of people are starting to think about this, and I'm sure it's going to be a question that's asked of you and anyone that's running for this office. What is your stance on that ban, as much as you can say?
Sure. No, I'm happy to talk about it. And, I think I'm interesting on this particular issue as a candidate for AG for a host of reasons, because, I'm a lawyer, I'm a legal nerd in all the true sense of the word. But I started my career as an Army JAG, and a year of that time I spent in Baghdad during the height of the Iraqi war, where I was serving abroad and deployed with the 3rd Infantry Division, and honored to receive the Bronze Star Medal for my year of service abroad. But every day when I went to work, I carried my laptop and my M16 A2 assault rifle every day. And I used to shoot a lot in the Army. And so I've been around and exposed to firearms for much of my life, and certainly for that point of my career. So I know more personally about firearms than your average lawyer and your average Democratic politician, certainly. At the same time, that experience gave me a real insight to how dangerous weapons of war can be in the public, in our community, in our neighborhoods. And there are many things that we need to do to make sure that we're limiting access to dangerous weapons to the general public, and not making this a more dangerous environment. So for most of my life, I've advocated for what I view as common sense gun safety measures. In private practice, I've helped represent the Alliance for Gun Responsibility, which is the premier nonprofit organization in Washington that advances gun safety measures. And Washington has taken more and more important steps to enact gun safety measures. And those things save lives. I want to be just very, very clear about that. The things that we have done in Washington over the last few years has saved people's lives, from limiting assault weapons to requiring safe storage of firearms to advancing ERPO legislation, the Extreme Risk Protection Order bills, to putting a ban on high capacity magazines. These things save lives. And the reason I say that, we talk about gun violence a lot and we think about mass shootings and assault rifles, but the number one cause of firearm death is suicides. And suicide is something that I think we can all relate to. We're all 1 or 2 degrees of separation away from someone who has attempted suicide or committed suicide. It's something that impacts everyone across the state, no matter who you are or what you look like or where you live. And that is really important. And Washington has shown that the gun safety measures that we've supported have reduced our suicide rate. And one of the really important statistics for me is, suicide rates went up across the country during COVID era for a whole host of reasons, for the availability of guns, for the stress and anxiety and isolation we're keeping, and they went up across the country. They did not go up in Washington state. In fact, we went from about the 9th most suicides in the country to closer to 20. And there are lots of different reasons for that. But one of the important reasons, I believe, is that we had important gun safety measure laws that were enacted and starting to take effect during that time, including ERPO, which allows people to temporarily remove firearms from a family member who they believe might cause harm to themselves or others, or the safe storage requirements. It requires firearm owners to store their firearms in safe conditions, thereby slowing down the time by which they'll get their firearms and cause harm to themselves or others. And that has saved lives. I mean, that it's not a partisan statement. It's not a political statement. I think it's just a fact. So the high capacity magazine ban is one of those important steps. And it was a common sense piece of legislation passed by the legislature that allowed magazines for your rifles or for your firearms, but they had to have 10 or less rounds in the part of the magazine. That was overturned by a Cowlitz County judge in an opinion that I think is highly questionable. And as you noted, was immediately stayed by the Supreme Court commissioner and ultimately will get decided by the Supreme Court. It's really important to note that all across the country, in states, courts, and in federal courts, bans on high capacity magazines have been upheld almost universally. So I'm glad the Supreme Court put the stay on that order. I do not think the Cowlitz County judge's opinion is consistent with the law or precedent. And I'm very hopeful and optimistic that our state Supreme Court will reverse that decision and allow the legislation to withstand scrutiny.
You just had me think about something when you mentioned earlier about most of the legislators that are pushing these laws and rules one way or the other don't necessarily have that as direct experience with weaponry as you do. Do you plan on kind of leaning into your military background when you're talking about these things to the public? Because I think that's not something that's usually heard.
Well, I mean, it's part of my story. It's part of who I am. I come from a family of 2 Army veterans. That's how my parents met. Actually, they met at Walter Reed Army Medical Hospital in the 60s in Washington, D.C. where my father was a young lieutenant on the staff there, and my mother was an Army nursing student. They should not have been dating, to be clear, but they did. And my father served 27 years in the Army, and my mom served a few as an Army nurse. And so it's part of my story. And for me, it was a great way to start my legal career. But also it was a great training ground of public service and working with other people from across the country and giving to your community and leadership development. When you're a JAG, you're a lawyer, but you're a soldier first. And serving as an officer and leading troops and working with people across the spectrum gave me a lot of foundation for the things that I've done later in my career. And so as I travel across the state and as I meet people and tell my story, that's a big part of who I am. And I think it is something, because there are so many veterans in this community, so many active duty military members, more than many states in this country, it provides a connection with a lot of different people across the political spectrum. I'm very much a Democrat, a proud Democrat, and progressive on many things. But when I walk into a room and say, I'm a veteran, I was deployed, I received a Bronze Star, that gives people an opportunity to hear me a little differently, and not your average Seattle-based Democrat has that sort of experience and familiarity. And I think it builds connection and connection with people across the state. So I found that to be a really useful way to introduce myself and talk to people and at least get people to listen to the things that I'm talking about as priorities for the state.
So you touched on this a little bit, but want to go more specific. Why you and why now for this role, for running for this office?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, even though I've never run for office before, I've been around government politics for a long time, but I've never run before. And so, part of running is selling yourself to people and introducing yourself and telling your story. The why me question and why now is a really important one, in part because people don't really understand what the AG's office is or does. And they might have some familiarity with the work that AG Ferguson has done or prior AGs, but for the most part, it's not something that people are really familiar with in the way that they might be a governor's office. But when I think about we're electing an attorney general, you're essentially electing two things. One is a lawyer, and two is an executive and a leader. In terms of legal background, I think my resume and some of the experience that we've talked about really prepares me for the job of being the attorney general. I've been on both sides of the aisle as a criminal lawyer, representing people and representing the government. I've done complex criminal investigations, working with multiple agencies and multi-jurisdictions, sometimes millions of dollars in cases, or complex gang investigations across districts. So I've worked on really big, hard, complex matters, serving as the governor's counsel and being the chief legal advisor for the governor and his team, and working across state government on legal issues that they were facing, and working directly with the attorney general and his team really gave me a good insight to some of the issues that the office has, that how they operate and some of the challenges they're facing. That's direct firsthand experience to the job of being the attorney general. And then in private practice, I've done complex civil litigation, dealing with constitutional law issues. And in my career, I've appeared in the Federal Court of Appeals multiple times. I've briefed and appeared in our state Supreme Court. This is the type of work that the AG's office does. It is also the type of experience that no one else running has. I think I've got good opponents and certainly have a lot of respect for the other Democrat running. But my type of legal experience, I think, makes me stand out and makes me unique for this role. But maybe even more important to that, the job of the attorney general is in large part a management and executive job. There are about 800 lawyers in the AG's office across 13 offices in the state, hundreds more staff members, a budget of hundreds of millions of dollars. It is a massive and hard management job. And I think having served as the U.S. attorney most recently, particularly coming in after the Trump administration and the Trump Department of Justice and trying to reinvigorate that office and lead that office, was an immense challenge. And I'm really proud of the work that we were able to do there. But for me, that was a culmination of progressively more challenging and important leadership responsibilities, going way back to the job I mentioned in the Army of managing the income tax center, when I was a brand new lieutenant and I had about 15 soldiers all of a sudden that reported to me. They were senior enlisted and had to do their evaluations and do their training and manage that office. And I was fresh out of law school in 24, 25. And so going from that to being the governor's council to being the U.S. attorney, I think it's been a really nice trajectory and training ground to then come in and lead the attorney general's office. And again, I think it's experience that separates me from anybody else. And it makes me the best prepared and the best candidate for this job. And, my job is now just to make sure I can do everything I can to communicate with people, to introduce myself to people, and to convince them that I should be the lawyer for the people of the state of Washington.
Hey, and on that note, I want to say, I'm going to leave you with the last word. What is something that you want to leave to those that are going to be watching, those that are voters that will be going to the ballots, sometime soon? What message do you want to give to your potential constituents?
Well, I just really appreciate that people are paying attention, and this is an office that really matters. It really matters for your day-to-day life because of the work that we do representing the state and representing the people, from good quality legal services for state agencies to protecting your rights in consumer protection or civil rights, or protecting our environment, or protecting your right to have an abortion. The AGs is the front lines for all these really important things that we think about and we care about. And because of my experience and background, I think I'm the best person for this job. So I would ask people to continue to learn about me, and you've put our website up there. You can also follow me on social media at Nick Brown Now on most of the social media channels. And I think that if people start to learn about me, that they'll decide that I'm somebody they can support, and I'm happy to help spread that word as much as I can.
Nick, thank you so much for taking time out of your day, your time out of campaigning to have this conversation with me. I learned a lot. I hope others that are watching too learned a little bit more about who you are interpersonally. And I'm sure I'm going to see you around town.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. So with that, I will say thank you, and have everyone else, let's look out for the next Civically Speaking. Take care, everybody.